you said, you have a family history of violence in Dollar River, and you were carrying that around.
Yeah.
It was part of how you ended up where you were.
Yeah.
38, almost dying. Can you talk a little bit about that family history, as much as you feel comfortable?
Yeah. And so there was always the story of my grandfather, who was murdered in 1976, a couple years before I was born. My grandparents had an apartment in Camden, and a guy came to rent the apartment. And so he put a deposit down and then disappeared for like 10 weeks. And so he came back wanting his money back. And my grandfather was like, I'll see you in court. You know, it's non-refundable. They actually had a court date set for that December. And my grandfather worked at a pipe installation factory, so he worked a late shift, would come home until like midnight or after. And so after the dude, you know, was rebuffed, he came back and murdered my grandfather, shot and killed him after work. And so that story was always present. And his
How did that
absence,
story get told in your family's life?
it was always kind of like that. I mean, we didn't talk about it a lot. It was always there. And my grandfather, they call Big Daddy, you know, Big Daddy, big, you know, he had a presence about him, and everybody loved him. But he was a patriarch kind of guy. And so, you know, hearing decades later the hurt and pain, if my uncles and aunts ever talk about it, it was still palpable. We have these beautiful family portraits that they took a year or so before he was killed that were always around. Big, beautiful sepia, old school, you know, one of my uncles in his Vietnam uniform, and others with their boat, you know, it was just that old school kind of picture that was always there. And so, you know, we talked about it like that, loving it, missing it. But then what I didn't know was that there have been other killings in my family. And so going back to 1922 in rural Georgia, where my great-grandparents are from, my grandmother was born, my grandmother's older brother was 12 years old, shot, killed in a sundown town in a neighboring county. The old, you know, kind of the stories that we've heard time and again. They joined the Great Migration, landed first in Philly and then in South Jersey. And then in 1951, a second of my grandmother's brother was shot and killed by a state trooper. And
That's up?
in South Jersey.
Oh, wow.
So they get up here, and years later, the specter of violence is still there. And so when you read the headline, it's like, trooper's gun kills youth. Typical amorphous, the gun just popped up and shot him. And the story of how he was killed is like, it sounds like Mike Brown. It sounds like any of those stories that we've heard time and time again. And then it was my grandfather. And then in 96 in Camden, a girl shot and killed my stepbrother, shot me back in the head. And then in the early 2000s in Atlantic City, one of my cousins was murdered, and then his brother was arrested in a botched robbery turned murder. And so carrying the psychic inheritance of that, let alone the stories and what it actually does to you, shapes and reshapes and misshapes how you're raised and how you live and how you move and all those things. There was this other kind of residue that I think has clung to our family and me in ways that I recognized and ways that I didn't. And then I'm arriving, telling the stories that I do the way that I do because of, I think, the broad lack of humanity in seeing us wholly. But in doing that work, I remember being in Philly, you know, as a young police reporter, and we get to the scene before the police get there, 'cause I got the scanner, and seeing a young man that looks just like us, dead, right? And the ripples of his family, and sitting in that, and still having to work through, process your own trauma and exposure to that, while also getting the stories. And so,
When did you recognize you were carrying that around though? Like,
it wasn't until many years later, it wasn't until through New Orleans, Katrina, that it really came to a head for me. I didn't recognize it early on because I felt like, one, exposed enough where it wasn't bothering me. It took a lot, the energy, and as journalists, we know the energy it takes to like, how you doing, man? Tell me about your son.
people don't want to talk to you, you know.
You got to do all that. Can I get the picture? And then it becomes such a matter of course and routine that you have to sit some of that weight aside just to do the job, as we know. So it wasn't until many, many years later.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Can I get one, bro?
Yeah, I'm coming around. I was trying not to cut in front of the crowd. My bad.
In New Orleans. Thank you, brother. Appreciate you.
Did you man's thinking? You mentioned Katrina.
Yeah.
So